And there we really are, matching our nameplates. Hi,
Hello.
Ellie Leonard. How are you? Thanks for being here
Hi,
tonight.
Zevshilev.
It's
It's
really
good to
nice
be
to
here.
hear. You have the best name ever, by the way. I really got to
Oh,
tell you.
what?
Yeah,
It's
Ellie
all
Leonard.
vowels.
It's so good. It's so good. It just sounds like It sounds like you're like a 1970s rock musician,
Oh,
or what
yeah.
you are right now, like a great like beats. What is it? What's the movement they called in
Ugh.
the 1970s? The beats movement.
Oh,
Author.
yeah.
It's what I
It's
get.
e- I have an old, so my name is actually Eleanor, and it's kind of popular again, but when I was a kid, it was only people over the age of 80 that had the name Eleanor, and I just hated it so much, and it took me a really long time. And now I'm fine with it, but now it's just like you hear it all the time, so.
Where were you? By the way, I don't know if you've accepted the invite I just sent you because I had to resend it to you. So, if
I think I did. I think I
okay,
did.
okay. Did do you? It's a different stream, by the way, than we had originally planned. So maybe you
Yes.
did. Okay. Where were you born? Just out of curiosity.
I was born in Port Angeles, Washington. So I'm up on the upper Olympic Peninsula, really close to Canada. Victoria, BC we have a little ferry boat that's 100 years old that you could just take across for an hour. Used to be $9 to go to Canada
Oh, really?
and no passport. Yeah.
Yeah. And now you would get across as easily now?
No, now you need a passport. Now I don't even know how much it costs. We
Yeah.
haven't been there in probably 10 years, so
Well, I'm glad you're in the mix here, and I'm glad we get to
yes,
hang out, even
glad
if you're
you're
not in Canada. We get to hang out
here.
virtually. No, we're here today because the Greatest Heist Book 2 sort of launched yesterday, in the prologue at least launched yesterday, and then part 1, which you're the only person to ever see the preview of right now. Um, so you've seen what's coming up next. And what I wanted to do today is take some questions from anyone who's watching. This will be free right now, but in the later versions, it's going to be recorded and only for paid viewers. But those of you who are joining online, I'm looking at your chats. And as we talk through this evening about what the Greatest Heist is, what it was, look back at what book 1 was as well, and then what we're planning to achieve in book 2, because this really is a story which has been waiting to be told for a long time. And as Ellie can attest, it's been it's been helped lately by the release of brand new Epstein documents that were previously sealed but are now unsealed, which is why the story, which I'd been working on for a long time, suddenly come to life with an enormous amount of new documents that are being released into the public, which really tell the story of how Jeffrey Epstein and J.P. Morgan had a extensive relationship. And J.P. Morgan is a bank, of course. In Jeffrey Epstein's case, when you use the word relationship, you have to be careful. But in this case, it was a
Oh,
financial relationship that lasted 15 years, if not longer, but really was not only just a client banking relationship as you might have, but really was the basis for what caused the 2008 crash, which we are also familiar with. We called it the Great Recession. It was so big. And many, many people, millions of people lost their homes, millions of people lost their jobs. It was a horrific experience to live through. What? I don't know how old you are, so I don't know exactly what you were
I'm
doing in
not going to tell.
2008. You don't have to.
I was just getting out of college, so
Mhm.
it was an ironic time to graduate college because my husband and I, we weren't married yet, but like, we had our degrees. He had a really good business degree.
Mm.
He'd come out of a really good business school, and we were competing with people who had PhDs for like entry level food service jobs. I mean,
Mm.
just nothing that we had ever planned on doing when we got out of college. And so I still feel like we're dealing with the repercussions of that because there were no internships. There was nothing that you expect coming out of college that sort of prepares you for an industry or a career path. We were set backwards, and I still feel like we're playing catch up to that now, that we still lost those opportunities.
Absolutely. And it's not just that crash. There were crashes in 1987. There were crashes after the World Trade Center. There were crashes at the dot-com crash. All these crashes kept taking away people like yours future. They really stole
Hmm.
your futures and your American dream. We now see this $38 billion deficit, and we wonder how we got here. And the answer is we got here through um, through an enormous amount of crime. People basically rigged the
Mhm.
system in order to get rich themselves. And one of the people who got rich of crimes like this and out of that network is, of course, Donald Trump, who's in office right now. And we're still waiting for those Epstein files to come out. Maybe they will in the near future now that there's a new
Mhm.
urgency around getting their house
Right.
back in order. But what's in those files is likely this story, because this story is truly what drove Jeffrey Epstein. He was a collapse specialist as early as the Towers financial crisis, which Steve Hoffenberg was one of my sources there. Steve was the guy who went to jail for Epstein's crimes, and what Hoffenberg
Right.
kept saying was that Epstein was responsible for the crimes, that the Ponzi scheme that was Towers Financial was in fact was Jeffrey Epstein's idea. They did it on purpose. They built this thing, they pumped it up, and then they crashed it. There's evidence as well that he was involved in the same thing that happened to Drexel, which precipitated the 1987 crash. And so when you look at all the way from 1987 to 2008, those two are very similar. How those things unrolled were very similar. I was even looking at some CNBC archive tape just to see how the morning shows covered things in exactly the same way. Very little had the script was pre-written already for those days. So by the time the market crashed, it was too late for anyone to actually retrieve the money. The script um, was already written, and they knew what the outcome was going to be, which is devastating when you think about the fact that these people were making billion-dollar deals. The purchase of Bear Stearns to JP Morgan was $12 billion essentially. And the fact that they were doing that at a time when people were losing their homes in their hundreds of thousands
Yeah.
around America is just kind of it just speaks to the soul of the people involved and the kind of people that were involved in this criminal activity and in banking in America at the time. From your perspective, when you think about these guys getting so rich, and we see how much wealth they've amassed over the
Mhm.
years, it must really strike you.
Well, I mean, it's just one more thing when you're going through this. So Zeph and I have been kind of digging through these U.S. Virgin Island versus J.P. Morgan court case documents, and when you're digging through these, like, it's shocking how many steps along the way nothing was investigated, or maybe someone said, "Hey, this should be investigated," and someone went, "Nah, let's not do it right now." And when you're in the middle of a crash and everybody's losing their homes, and somebody like Bear Stearns is going bankrupt, and you see JP Morgan go, "I'll buy you, and I haven't lost anything, and I have all this excess cash."
Mm.
That should have been investigated, I would think, in that moment, because nobody else was in that position to do that. And they presented it as Jamie Dimon was this very conservative, cautious guy, but nobody was conservative and cautious enough in that moment to have an extra however many billions of dollars to buy an entire banking financial system.
Yeah, and in fact, it was financed by the Fed. At the end of the day, the reason they
Mhm.
were able to do it is because the Fed encouraged the sale of Bear Stearns to J.P. Morgan because they didn't want the market to crash. Of course, months later, it landed up crashing anyhow, which is why people are always ask the question about, well, why was Bear Stearns saved and why was Lehman Brothers not saved? And the answer is really Jeffrey Epstein, because as we know,
Mhm.
as we discovered before, his relationship with Bear Stearns goes back all the way to the early or late 70s and early 80s.
Right.
And when you were going through that book, the 50th birthday book that Epstein got from Ghislaine Maxwell, that's what triggered my thinking about writing this particular book, is because there's a photograph or of a letter from what's his name? Ace
Is it-
Greenberg. Grace Greenberg?
mhm.
Yes, Ace Greenberg, who was the CEO of Bear Stearns. And he was writing Jeffrey Epstein and this was 25 years after Jeffrey Epstein had left Bear Stearns under somewhat disgraced circumstances. And it just made me think, how come he's writing this nice letter to Jeffrey Epstein 25 years later? And it seemed like they still know each
Right.
other and they're still involved with each
Yeah.
other. Um,
It's
and
why did he hire him in the first place? He was one of his students' father. You know
yeah,
what I mean? Like,
exactly.
he was a defunct math teacher. Why did you hire him to work at Bear Stearns in the first place?
Yeah. And then so
Same
to
question.
have his relationship now revealed that it's so much many years later, now we know why. Because what we'll reveal in the coming weeks is that Jeffrey Epstein was still in business with Bear Stearns all the way till 2008 or 2007. So right, even all the way through the early parts of that court case that he was charged with. Um, even afterwards, when he had the plea bargain, he was still working with Bear Stearns, and it's only just before the collapse in 2008 that he stops working with Bear Stearns. But it means that that relationship, which they had said was over so many years earlier, that made him lose
Mhm.
his license, made him do all these things, never actually ended, and it carried on all the way to that point, which again lays a huge question mark over what Bear Stearns really was. The other thing we discovered
Mhm.
when we was looking through that book is that Robert Maxwell, knew Jeffrey Epstein all the way from the 1970s and 80s because of exactly the same thing. He
Right.
was a client of Bear Stearns as well, which certainly makes you think, if you've got Donald Trump, Robert Maxwell, and Jeffrey Epstein, all clients of the same financial firm. And that is the financial firm that gets saved in the 2008 crisis, that it still involves Jeffrey Epstein at that time. Who knows if it involved Donald Trump? I guess that's a question to be answered. But it involved Jeffrey Epstein for that long period of time. It makes it a very unique kind of investment banking or investment
Yeah.
bank. This doesn't feel like your typical investment bank after all that.
No. There's too much personal relationship involved. If you read through these emails, they don't read like banking emails. They don't read like typical client banking emails. I mean, especially from Jez Staley. I mean, all his emails are very personal and saying, "I miss you," and I went out to the hot tub on the island, and next time we need to do this together. And it's a very weird interaction from your financial institution. Like a lot of fishy discussion for me personally.
Yeah. Can you tell people a little bit more about Jess Staley? Because he's the slimiest sounding guy for these emails. I mean, it really is. He's a senior executive
Yeah,
was at J.P. Morgan,
yeah,
and he was the first guy to meet Epstein when he became a client. But they built a very strong friendship.
they did. And I believe at the time or during that time, he was CEO, was he not, at JP Morgan?
He was always number two. I don't think he was the CEO. I
Was he
think
number
maybe
two?
I
Okay,
think
okay.
it was number two under Warner. Or
Warner. Okay,
yeah, I think
okay.
so.
So very high up. He was always in the conversations when they would start to bring up some of the red flags that which they did. They brought up red flags for in a typical financial situation, there are red flags for human trafficking that they pay attention to, and those red flags popped up. And then when he was arrested for trafficking in 2006, they popped up quite a bit more, and they mentioned them a lot more. But they were always batted down because he was one of the top investors at JP Morgan. So in comes Jess Staley. Jess Staley was kind of the moderator. Whenever they started to get their heckles up to like, maybe we need to investigate this guy, Jess Staley would come in and say, no, you don't, no, you don't, no, you don't. Because he was best friends. Or there's all these weird people who claim to be his best friend, but the emails there's about 3 pages of email summaries from Jess Staley to Jeffrey Epstein, and they are too personal for a financial institution.
Yeah.
They almost sound like they were in a relationship, which is very interesting because I've heard from other people that Jess Staley preferred girls who looked like boys.
Hmm.
And so you have him having this relationship with Epstein on whatever level, but he's supposed to be his financial manager, and he's calling saying, "I'm meeting you on the island," or "I'm going to come meet you downtown," or "We can't say anything, but let's have a hug downtown today,"
Hmm.
because Epstein wasn't supposed to be off house arrest, and they would meet up in places that he wasn't supposed to be. So there was just a lot of really inappropriate relationships between them that were a conflict of interest,
That's really
considering.
interesting. Michael Wolff
Yeah,
was on the other night, and he was talking about the friendship between Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein being like that, being so close that it was almost like the closest relationship both of them had ever had. And maybe that's a
right,
thing that Epstein did. Maybe that's the way he lured his people in or targets in. I'm not suggesting that Jess Staley was some innocent target, but you know,
right.
um, what I found really interesting looking at another batch of emails as well was that Jeffrey Epstein clearly had introduced Jess Staley to Ehud Barak,
Mhm.
which is the former prime minister of Israel, the former defense minister of Israel, and by all accounts feels to be like one of the handlers of Jeffrey Epstein post, after he was incarcerated. I wouldn't call it incarcerated, after his home arrest. Um,
Mhm.
we had this period of time where, why is this senior executive at this bank having personal conversations with the former Israeli prime minister? And then you start to think about, well, what is that relationship about, and was JP Morgan really a target um, for the Israelis, or the Israeli Russian mob, or the Israeli intelligence services and the FSB, whoever, this whole collection of intelligence interests? Were they trying to capture JP Morgan through Jess Staley, through these other executives, in order to create this 2008 crash? To have the buy-in of a major bank, where you could finesse things, where you could, do all sorts of sneaky things and come up with compromised executives that would do those sneaky things for you. Would be a big target for any intelligence operation.
Right. And they were definitely interacting with some interesting groups of people because they were interacting with the Treasury Department on multiple occasions in 2008, but also in 2014. They talk about a lot, speaking with financial officials in Dubai and China. They were speaking with two vice presidents of like finance in China. And it's really interesting because the relationship between Epstein and Staley is very dominant submissive. So Staley was definitely the submissive of the two, and he would say, "Well, I'm going off. I'm going to give this speech at this whatever we're doing," and Epstein would step in and say, "You're not going to give that speech. You're going to step to the side. This other person's going to give the speech. You're going to keep your mouth shut. You're going to do A, B, C, and D." And he was very much in charge and in control of Jess Staley and all the moves that he made, but he was controlling him to start speaking in Russia and all these different places to financial ministry people, and I can't imagine that it didn't have plans to go bigger and bigger and more global.
It sounds so interesting, because in my impression as well, in reading some of those emails, is that it was the relationship between a handler and an asset. Because even when he went to China, Jess Staley and Jamie Dimon go to China and get a deal, for JP Morgan to access the Chinese market, was a really big deal. It's Jess Staley that gets to meet the premier of Russia, I think, of China, the number two guy, at least, and that
Right.
the prime minister is then met uh, by Diamond. But the conversation that preceded the meeting with the Chinese, Epstein was like giving Staley like instructions on how to behave, on what to ask,
Right.
on the things to expect, cultural issues, the kind of things that you
Yes.
would not.
Yes.
This guy's a financial advisor, maybe a tax advisor. He's not an expert in Chinese culture, in how you should approach the
Right.
Chinese. And so you really begin to think of that as, was Jamie Dimon and Jess Staley being sent on a mission, really, by the Israelis in order to build this relationship with the Chinese? Or maybe the Chinese were involved as well, because they would love access to the JP
Yeah.
Morgan Bank of the United States, the biggest bank in the United States. But so this all happens, which is strikes me so incredibly, is it happens um after 2008. He gets his conviction. He goes to house arrest, and then they let him become an even closer client to them. That's when they
Yes.
build up their relationship with them, which I don't know if you noticed that, but to me it was
Mhm.
kind of
Yeah.
stunning.
Yeah, the timeline. I just love the investigations by there's a woman and a man who do an investigation, and they're kind of like financial investigators, and they talk about how many times this would have been stopped along the way
Oh,
had it been them making the decision, and just the timeline is so silly because it's like clearly he was arrested for sex trafficking. Then they have all these red flags for a bank account that is committing sex. I mean, he had 84 accounts at,
mhm.
at JP Morgan, and
And
then he was connected to,
134 at one point.
yeah, and
Yeah,
he was connected to another
yeah,
69
yeah,
that were Epstein. So I mean, and he has business accounts, except for everything that he's buying in them is like lingerie, or he's
yeah.
making payments that are just under the threshold by a few cents to not be reported. And then they do nothing this entire time, and then he dies, and then they like file a huge report 3 days later. And
Right.
it's just the whole thing is so shady.
Yeah, which is 2019. So, he left the bank as a
Yeah.
client in 2013. 6 years
Mhm.
later, that's when they decide to file the suspicious activity reports. Now, why would you do that? Why on earth would you do that unless you were covering your own tracks because you don't want people looking into
Yeah.
this business
Yeah.
because your business is compromised by this man. And there's also these other executives. It's not just Jess Daly. There's another guy. Nelson is the other guy's. I don't know what his first name is. John Nelson, maybe. And then there's
Yeah,
the
yeah, same initials.
and then there's Erdos, who's the head of the private wealth bank,
Mhm.
who and Jess Daly and Erdos have this incredible conversation the day after they find out about Epstein um, and his crimes. And she says, "Oh, it makes you sad," or something like that. I can't remember the exact expression, but it's just sad about that. And then he says, "Oh yeah, I saw him yesterday. He absolutely denies all the ages,
Yeah.
as if he's not denying the charges, but he's denying the ages. Like that's his
Yeah.
response." And then they sort of wrap their arms around Epstein, and
Mm.
literally, Staley says, "I'm going to want to give you a big hug," and then they give him extra loans. They welcome him.
Well,
Even
it's it's because a lot of them were connected to him on more than just money. They
Mm.
were connected to him for the things that he's being arrested for. So they're not gonna convict him themselves for the things that they enjoy doing. I mean, so much after this has happened, Jess Staley sends him 100 emails saying, "I want to meet you at the island. I wish you were
Mm.
here. I'm in the hot tub. I'm drinking mimosas, whatever." He clearly has no problem with Epstein's crimes. Like there's no love lost there. I don't know.
There's no love's lost as well. The non-prosecution agreement didn't name anyone. It just said anyone connected to Jeffrey Epstein who could not be
Mhm.
prosecuted for his crimes. We
Yeah.
found out recently that one of the things they were investigating was money laundering. That was also killed in that
Yep. January.
same prosecution agreement. So was Jess Staley included in that non-prosecution agreement? And did he feel emboldened after that non-prosecution agreement to go after him as a client? Because, hey, he couldn't be arrested because he's not going to get prosecuted because of this crazy
Right.
deal. It's possible.
Which is interesting, though. The question I have about that is I know for the non prosecution agreement for the four women who were his accomplices, his assistants, that non prosecution agreement only applied in the state of Florida for
Mm.
them. So they could technically be arrested and prosecuted in another state. So I don't know how that works for someone like Jess Staley, who
Mm.
wasn't in Florida, obviously. I don't know.
I mean, no one was expecting anyone to do anything until
Yeah.
the Ghislaine Maxwell. There were those prosecute. Everyone assumed that because the prince was involved, because Prince Andrew was involved, this thing would have disappeared forever, and no one was ever going to touch Jeffrey Epstein again. I think that's basically the reason that they were given this non-prosecution agreement. So then to have they have felt very emboldened that he got off all these
Mhm.
investigations. He got off the money laundering investigation. He got a slap on the
Right.
wrist for the human trafficking. I mean, that puts him in a very esteemed position where you can do almost any crime.
Yeah, and I think that gave him more ego, if that's possible, after that was done. He wasn't timid and he wasn't intimidated by having been prosecuted. I think he felt he had more power. He started to have more plans. He was buying a second island in 2016. He was buying Great St. James. Like he had plans for
I
a
think they actually
fairly
bought
future.
that. I think he bought that, or
Yeah.
a sultan. Someone in some
No,
Middle
he
East sultan
he
financed it. I
he
think.
bought it under his name.
Yeah.
So he used his name to buy it, but the Sultan claims not to have known anything about signing anything because he signed it in the Sultan's name. So he forged the Sultan's name to buy the island.
Or he
And
was
he had,
allowed to use,
yeah,
all the deals that he signed with his clients that gave
right.
him complete ability to sign on their behalf.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So he had,
yeah,
go ahead.
no, the guy's name is Sultan Salyan,
Mhm.
the Dubai Sultan, and he could have been um, he could have been involved in that purchase. And then there's also
Mhm.
Farkas who was involved in that. But you're right, he
Right,
was buying another island.
right.
He was
3
fitting,
times the size.
yeah.
I mean, he had poured the concrete, he had dug the roads and the like, it's interesting to think what the plan for that island was. People said that, oh, it's so that he could stop people from seeing Little St. James. They wouldn't have as much view of it from the mainland, or the helicopters couldn't fly over it. But I don't think he could sit back on his heels with an island 3 times the size and just
No,
use it as
he
a
would have used
blockade.
it. Yeah, he would have used it.
Yeah.
I mean, he probably want, the amount of money that there was that he was spending those days. It's so interesting. They say he was the number one client of JP Morgan Private Wealth. And at some point was generating $60 million in revenue for that part of the bank. It's
Hmm.
a lot of money for someone who's only worth $600 million at his death. So you got to think about
Right.
how much real money was going through offshore